At 80 years old, Eric Clapton has finally admitted the identity of the one woman he could never forget. His decade-long obsession with Pattie Boyd inspired some of his greatest music, but also fueled years of addiction and heartbreak. Wait till the end to hear about the devastating letter he sent after their divorce and where they stand today. There's a photograph taken in London sometime in the early 1970s. Eric Clapton is sitting in a room with his guitar. George Harrison is in the same room. They're laughing, best friends, brothers in music. And somewhere in that same house, or just off to the side of the frame, is the woman who would eventually stand between them, Pattie Boyd. She doesn't know it yet. Maybe none of them do. But that tension, that slow, burning, impossible tension, was already there. Eric Clapton was born on March 30, 1945 in Ripley, Surrey. From the start, his life was built on a foundation that shifted beneath him without warning. He grew up believing that his grandmother Rose and her second husband, Jack Clapp, were his parents, and that his biological mother was actually his older sister. The truth didn't reveal itself until later, and when it did, it left a mark. A man who grew up feeling like the ground wasn't solid under him, who learned early that the people closest to you might not be who you think they are. That man doesn't love gently, he loves desperately, and the guitar was his outlet from the start. He joined the Yardbirds in 1963, still a teenager. He later joined Cream in 1966, producing some of his greatest hits like White Room and Sunshine of Your Love. By the time the 1960s were in full swing, Eric Clapton was already a legend. The walls of London had graffiti spray painted on them, "Clapton is God." He was 21 years old. The whole world was watching him play. But there was one woman he couldn't get to watch him back. Pattie Boyd was born on March 17, 1944 in Taunton, Somerset. She grew up and moved to London as a teenager, eventually finding her way to Elizabeth Arden's salon, where she started as a shampoo girl. Her stunning looks led to her becoming a top model by the time she was 18, and she quickly moved through London, Paris, and New York, appearing in Vogue and in multiple commercials. She was the image of the era, that particular kind of golden, effortless cool that defined London in the early 1960s. In 1964, she won a part in the Beatles movie, A Hard Day's Night. She was cast as a schoolgirl, a fan in the film, screaming alongside everyone else. But on set, George Harrison was immediately smitten and asked her to dinner. She turned him down the first time because she was already seeing someone. A week later, newly single and back on set for a photo shoot, she changed her answer. And the course of her life forever. Less than 2 years after that first meeting, on January 21, 1966, they were married. Pattie Boyd became the wife of a Beatle, one of the 4 most famous men on the planet. And for a while it worked. It was real, it was full, and George wrote something for her, what many still consider the most beautiful love song the Beatles ever released. But marriages built in the white heat of fame don't always survive when the heat dies down. Eric Clapton entered this picture the way he entered most rooms, with a guitar and an intensity that was hard to ignore. He and George Harrison had become close friends in the way that only musicians really can, spending hours together in rooms full of sound, trading riffs, trading ideas, building something out of nothing. In the late 1960s, Harrison and Clapton became good friends and began writing and recording music together. And that's when Eric met Pattie. When Eric Clapton met Pattie Boyd, he was besotted with her from the start, but his love remained unrequited for more than a decade. She was his best friend's wife. She was off limits. She was, in every rational sense, completely untouchable. But Eric Clapton has never been particularly interested in rational. Sometime in 1969, he had fallen deeply in love with Pattie Boyd, who happened to be married to one of his closest friends, George Harrison. And what he did next tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. He didn't just feel it quietly. He didn't carry the feeling and let it go. He fought his feelings in 2 ways, with heroin and by writing songs about his infatuation. The pain became fuel. The longing became music. And what came out of that pressure, out of that impossible, burning love for a woman who was wearing another man's ring, was one of the greatest rock albums ever made. The crazy truth of the matter is that Layla, and the bulk of the material on the Lone Derek and the Dominoes album, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, was inspired by Clapton's obsession with Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. Think about that for a moment. He didn't just write a song about her, he built an entire band around the feeling. He hid behind the name Derek and the Dominoes, a mask, a disguise, because the music was too naked, too raw, too obviously about her for him to put his real name on it. From the start, the concept behind Derek and the Dominoes was a figurative mask for Clapton to wear. All he wanted was to play guitar, maybe sing, and just be part of a band. No spotlights turned on just one person, but something else powered those sessions that even Clapton probably hadn't anticipated. Something raw and unfiltered was bleeding out of him every time he picked up a guitar. And the band felt it. The studio felt it. You can still feel it today, more than 50 years later. When that opening guitar figure hits and your whole chest tightens, the song Layla is considered considered one of rock music's definitive love songs, featuring an unmistakable guitar figure played by Eric Clapton and Duane Allman as a lead-in. The title came from a Persian poem. The Layla song had been inspired by the story of Layla and Majnun by Persian author Nizami, a tale about a man who loved a woman so deeply it drove him to madness. Eric Clapton read that poem and thought, "This is me. This is exactly what this feels like." And he was right. Before the album came out, before Layla was even finished, Clapton was already sending letters. Physical, handwritten, desperate letters. The auction at Christie's in 2024 included 2 love letters from Clapton, written while Boyd was still married to Harrison. One of them written on a page torn from a copy of John Steinbeck's novel, Of Mice and Men, in 1970, tells you everything about where his head was. He couldn't find proper paper. He grabbed whatever was in front of him. He tore a page from a novel and wrote his heart on it. The first letter, sent to the Harrisons' Friar Park home in Oxfordshire, asked Boyd if she still loved her husband or had another lover. He wrote that the questions were impertinent, he acknowledged that. But he asked them anyway. "All these questions are very impertinent, I know, but if there is still a feeling in your heart for me, you must let me know." He was sending love letters to a married woman. At the home she shared with her husband, who also happened to be his best friend. That's not subtle. That's not hiding. That's a man on fire. In one of the auctioned letters, Clapton addressed Boyd as Layla, the name he endearingly called her. He had already rewritten her identity in his own mind. She wasn't just Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. She was Layla, his Layla. The woman from the poems. The woman he would lose his mind over. And the terrifying thing is she knew it. She read those letters. She heard the music. And for a long time, she said no anyway. Pattie Boyd later said that when she first heard Layla, which was inspired by her, she was really touched by it because it was such an emotional song. She felt the weight of it. But feeling touched and throwing your life into chaos are 2 different things. She was still married. She still loved George in some complicated way. And the world around them was still intact, or at least it looked that way from the outside. But something was cracking underneath the surface of the Harrison marriage. George was pursuing Eastern spirituality and other women, emulating Krishna, the Hindu deity who meditates and consorts with young maidens. He had invited a group of Hare Krishnas to live at their home without consulting her. The woman who had once been the center of his world was slowly being pushed to the edges of it. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton was doing something that crosses a line most people wouldn't even approach. He briefly dated Pattie's sister Paula, apparently trying to stay close to the Boyd family, close to Pattie, in any way he could manage. It wasn't rational. It wasn't fair to Paula. It was the behavior of a man who couldn't let go. And all of it, every twisted, desperate move, was happening while Layla was being pressed onto vinyl and shipped to stores. While the world was about to hear exactly what this obsession sounded like when it was electrified. Here's a question worth sitting with. At what point does love become something else? At what point does the pursuit of someone stop being romantic and start being something harder to name? Because Eric Clapton's pursuit of Pattie Boyd didn't just bend the rules of friendship and loyalty. It broke them slowly and methodically over the course of years. And the music that came out of it is so beautiful that people have always been tempted to forgive the method. But the method is part of the story. The years leading up to Pattie finally leaving George Harrison were messy in ways that had nothing to do with Eric Clapton. When her husband struck up one of the messiest celebrity affairs of the 1970s by becoming involved with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen Starkey, in 1974, Boyd decided she'd had enough. That was the moment that something shifted permanently. George had spread his wings publicly, visibly, and cruelly, with the wife of one of their closest friends. Pattie looked at that and started to see the marriage for what it had become. She wrote in her memoir that she could resist no longer. And you can understand why. On one side was a husband who was pulling away, who had affairs, who was disappearing into spirituality and freedom and the perks of being a famous, handsome, wealthy man. On the other side was Eric Clapton, who had been declaring his love in letters, in music, in every possible way for years. He hadn't gone anywhere. He had stayed. Boyd had a brief affair with Clapton at one point, but later returned to Harrison just as the Beatles were breaking up, and Clapton was in the early stages of an addiction to heroin. That's the part the fairy tale version of this story tends to skip over. Eric Clapton, during the years of his most passionate pursuit, was also descending into heroin addiction. He was fighting 2 wars at once, one against his own body, and one against the impossible geometry of loving someone who wasn't his. After finally breaking up with Harrison, Boyd returned to a now-clean Clapton, and the couple was married on March 27, 1979. He had fought through the heroines. He was on the other side of it, or so it seemed. And here finally, after a decade of waiting and writing and aching, was Patty. His Layla. The woman the whole world knew he'd been writing about. She was standing next to him at the altar. But the wedding itself tells you something about the cracks that were already there. Boyd described the wedding as more of a prank than a ceremony, an attempt by Clapton to win a drunken bet that he couldn't get his manager's picture in the paper. He arranged the wedding the very next day, made that manager his best man, and won the bet. The most romantic pursuit in rock history, years of heartbreak and music and letters, culminated in a bet. That detail says everything. But let's also give this its due. There were real moments. There was real tenderness between them. Because before all the chaos that followed, Clapton wrote Wonderful Tonight for Patty. The song is said to have been written for Boyd, a simple, aching ballad about watching the woman you love get dressed before going out, about being amazed by hers. It's the counterweight to Layla. One song is burning desperation. The other is quiet devotion. Both are about the same woman. Patty Boyd made her mark as a muse to both Clapton and Harrison, serving as the creative inspiration behind hits including the Beatles' Something, and Clapton's Layla and Wonderful Tonight. Think about what that means. Three of the most emotionally resonant songs of the rock era, Something, Layla, and Wonderful Tonight, all exist because of one woman. She didn't write them, she didn't perform them, but she was the reason they exist. She was the source, and that's a kind of power that no chart position or Grammy can fully capture. George Harrison himself understood the strange beauty of it. He attended Eric and Patty's wedding in 1979 and lovingly referred to himself as their husband-in-law. He joked about it. He showed up and he smiled and he called himself the husband-in-law. That's either the most emotionally evolved response in rock history, or it's a man so skilled at burying his feelings that he'd made peace with the situation in the only way he knew how. Probably both. In fact, Patty recalled the time she first told George she was with Eric. And he said, "Well, I'm glad you're going off with Eric instead of some idiot." And there's something both funny and quietly devastating about that. I'm glad it's Eric and not some idiot. As if losing your wife to your best friend was somehow the best-case scenario. As if the only acceptable consolation was that at least the man who took her was someone he respected. Despite the years of Eric's pursuit of Patty while she was married to George, there was no genuine crossover between each relationship, which arguably was the reason why Eric and George maintained their friendship. That friendship, that strange, resilient, impossibly tangled friendship, survived everything. Harrison was at the wedding. Boyd and Harrison remained lifelong friends even after both their marriages ended. Despite being in one of rock's most strange romantic entanglements, George and Patty remained lifelong friends. But the marriage between Patty and Eric was a different story. Because Eric Clapton had spent a decade wanting something, and now he had it. And as Bobby Whitlock, his own bandmate from the Dominoes, put it with brutal clarity, "The hunt was better than the kill." That's an awful sentence, but it might be the most honest thing anyone said about this relationship. The years of longing had been the engine. The songs had been the proof. The obsession had been the fuel. And now that she was there, now that she was actually his, the fire had to find somewhere else to burn. What it found was a bottle. A short time after the wedding, Eric had replaced heroin with alcohol as his preferred vice, following a pattern of behavior that was not only detrimental to his music, but contributed to the eventual breakup of his marriage. Patty had married a man she thought had fought through his demons. What she got instead was someone who had just traded one demon for another, and the new one wore a suit and showed up at dinner parties. Their relationship was turbulent from the get-go, with Clapton's spiraling alcoholism creating issues for the couple throughout the duration of their relationship. Patty had gone from one marriage full of quiet abandonment, George disappearing into spirituality and other women, to one full of loud, visible destruction. The drinking was constant. The behavior was unpredictable. And the man who had once declared his love in the most extraordinary music imaginable was now someone she barely recognized. The marriage became strained by Clapton's alcoholism, and he later admitted to being physically abusive towards Boyd. That's a sentence that stops you cold. The man who wrote Layla's, who tore pages from John Steinbeck novels to write love letters, who built a band just to scream his feelings out loud, admitted to being physically abusive. Eric Clapton in his autobiography did not look away from this. He was honest about what he had become, and what he had become was something he never should have allowed himself to be. Eric Clapton traded a heroin addiction for alcoholism, suffered disastrous love affairs, contemplated suicide while armed with a bottle of vodka, a gram of blow, and a shotgun. That's from contemporaneous accounts of what this period looked like from the inside. He was not just drinking. He was dissolving. The man who had been so certain that getting Patty would fix the hole inside him was now staring down the hole from the bottom of a bottle and finding it deeper than ever. On top of everything, he committed frequent infidelities, and in the 1980s, he fathered children with 2 different women outside of the marriage, while Boyd had suffered from miscarriages and unsuccessful IVF treatments. Sit with that for a moment. Patty was going through the pain of trying to have a child, through miscarriages, through the clinical cold of IVF, while Eric was having children with other women. When he told her about the second woman being pregnant, she was in the middle of her struggles with infertility and IVF. It was horrible. It was a stab in the heart, horrible, she said later. And you believe every word of it. The man who had once written the most desperate love songs in rock history, who had sent letters to her married home, who had named a band after his own disguise so he could scream her name from a stage, was now the one causing the heartbreak. The hunter had become something else entirely, and Patty Boyd, the woman he could never forget, was quietly figuring out how to leave. Every love story that turns painful has a moment where one person decides, quietly with no dramas, that they're done. Not angry anymore, not hoping anymore, just done. For Patty Boyd, that moment came in 1987. She left Eric in April 1987 and divorced him in 1989 on the grounds of infidelity and unreasonable behavior. The court language is sterile, infidelity and unreasonable behavior. But behind those legal words is a decade of everything we've described. The drinking, the abuse, the children with other women, the relentless, grinding dismantling of everything she had waited so long to build. His stated betrayals understandably took a toll on Boyd, and their marriage ended in 1989. She had spent her entire adult life at the center of rock royalty. First George Harrison, then Eric Clapton, 2 of the most famous musicians who ever lived. She had inspired some of the most celebrated music of the 20th century, and she had paid for that distinction in ways that never made it onto the album covers. Her stated reasons were the blues guitarist's years of alcoholism, as well as his numerous affairs, including one with Italian actress Lori Del Santo. Lori Del Santo, an Italian actress, was one of the women Eric was involved with during the marriage. And that relationship produced a son named Connor, a name that would later take on a grief so vast that it made everything else in Eric Clapton's life feel small. But before we get to Connor, before we arrive at the specific kind of devastation that reshaped Eric Clapton as a human being, let's stay with what the end of this marriage meant. Because what Patty Boyd said about it years later is one of the most quietly remarkable things about this whole story. She reflected on both marriages, both men, both decades of her life given over to the world of rock royalty, and she arrived at a conclusion that surprised people. In hindsight, she said she thought George was the love of her life, but he was playing around the whole time, and she called it hurtful. George, not Eric. The man who wrote something for her. The man she had left. The man who joked at her next wedding that he was the husband-in-law. Even after everything, after the years with Clapton, after the heartbreak of that marriage, she was still circling back to George, still measuring everything else against what they had been to each other in the beginning. And then she said something even more pointed about Eric. She later suspected that Clapton's pursuit of her when she was married to Harrison had more to do with the competitiveness between the musicians. That Clapton just wanted what George had. Read that slowly. She is suggesting that the great love, the obsession, the album, the letters, might have been, at least in part, about beating George Harrison, about having what George had, about winnings. That assessment doesn't make Layla less beautiful. The music doesn't care about the psychology of its origin, but it reframes the whole story in a way that is much harder to romanticize. It means the pursuit wasn't just love. It was competition. It was a man who had been measuring himself against his best friend for years, in music, in reputation, in everything, and who saw his friend's wife and felt something he couldn't name or contain. Part love, part need, part competition, all of it burning at once. Bobby Whitlock, the Dominoes bandmate who was actually there, was even blunter about it. They got married, and evidently, she wasn't what he wanted after all. The hunt was better than the kill. That happens, he said. That's a domino, someone who played on Layla, someone who was in the room when the music was being made. Saying plainly, the relationship didn't match the obsession. The reality couldn't hold the weight of the dreams. And yet, Eric Clapton, in his autobiography, didn't run from any of this. He delivered a brutally honest and unsparing look at his life, near death and recovery, interspersed with tales from an unparalleled music career. He didn't rewrite himself as the hero. He looked at what he had done to Patty, to himself, to everyone around him, and he put it on the page without flinching. That takes a specific kind of courage. Not the kind that plays stadiums. The quieter kind. After the divorce, Clapton entered a period of rebuilding. He found sobriety in 1987, the same year Patty left. Those two events happening in the same year tells a whole story on its own. The marriage was ending and the drinking was ending, and it's impossible to know which one caused which, or whether they were just two branches of the same reckoning. He got clean. He put down the bottles. He picked up the work of trying to be a different kind of man. He established the Crossroads Center Addiction Treatment Facility in Antigua, a direct consequence of his own experience with addiction. He wasn't just surviving recovery, he was trying to make it mean something for other people. He was converting the wreckage of his own life into something that might help someone else not end up in the same place. That's not a small thing. That's a man trying to pay a debt he knows he can never fully settle. He was also the only artist to be inducted 3 times into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. As a member of the Yardbirds, as a member of Cream, and as a solo artist. The music never stopped. Even when everything personal was in ruins, the guitar was always there. And if you listen to his work through the 1980s and into the 1990s, you can hear the shift. Less fire, more ache. Something in the tone had changed. The obsession had burned itself out, and what was left in the ashes was something sadder and wiser. Then came the loss that eclipsed everything else. In the early 1990s, Clapton's beloved 4-year-old son, Connor, died in a freak accident. Connor was the son he had fathered with Lori Del Santo, the Italian actress whose affair with him had been one of the final ruptures in his marriage to Patty. Connor fell from an open window of a New York apartment building. He was 4 years old, and Eric Clapton wrote Tears in Heaven about it, a song so raw and so quiet that it sounds like a man barely holding himself together with both hands. That song is its own story. But it matters in this story because of what it represents. The man who had poured his entire emotional life into pursuing Patty Boyd, who had turned obsession into art, who had made his heartbreak into something the whole world could hear, was now sitting with a grief that no song could fix. He wrote Tears in Heaven not because it helped. He wrote it because he didn't know what else to do. Because the guitar had always been the place where the feelings went when there was nowhere else for them. Patty Boyd, for her part, had moved on. She found her footing. She found her voice not as a model or a wife or a muse, but as a photographer in her own right. She became an accomplished photographer, and among her images are those taken during the Beatles' 1968 stay at Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's ashram in India. Photographs that now belong to history. She had been in those rooms, behind that lens, capturing moments that no one else was allowed to see. She had always been more than the woman the songs were about. Eric Clapton married Melia McEnery in 2002, and the couple have 3 daughters. He built a quieter life, the kind of life that the version of himself from 1970 would not have been able to imagine. A family, stability, sobriety. He had gone from the man who sent love letters to a married woman on pages torn from a Steinbeck novel, to a father raising daughters in the English countryside. The distance between those 2 versions of himself is almost impossible to measure. Patty married her 3rd husband, Rod Weston, a property developer, in 2015. They had met during a holiday in Sri Lanka, and the relationship had none of the storm of the ones that came before. Now in her 80s, Boyd is still going strong, and her photography exhibitions have earned acclaim for her keen eye. She is no longer the muse. She is the artist. She is the one holding the camera now, and there is something deeply satisfying about that. But the story between her and Eric Clapton, the emotional thread that ran through both their lives for so many decades, never fully closed. Because you don't write those letters, that music, that album, that legacy, and then just file it away and forget it. You carry it. You carry it because it shaped you, because it cost you, because it was the most fully alive you ever felt, even when it was destroying you. And at 80 years old, Eric Clapton is still carrying it. Here's the thing about songs. They outlast everything. The marriages end. The letters get sold at auction. The people get older and quieter and move on. But the music stays exactly where it was, frozen in the moment of its creation, carrying all the emotion that went into it as fresh as the day it was recorded. And when you go back and listen to the music Eric Clapton made in the years surrounding his relationship with Patty Boyd, really listen not just as background sound but as testimony, you start to hear things that interviews and memoirs can't quite capture. Layla, start there. The song is considered one of rock music's definitive love songs, featuring an unmistakable guitar figure that hits you in the chest from the first note. Its famously contrasting movements were composed separately by Clapton and Jim Gordon. The explosive screaming opening built by Clapton, and the delicate, dissolving piano coda written by Gordon. Together they create a song that starts on fire and ends in grief, which is exactly what the whole relationship did. Inspired by Clapton's unrequited love for Pattie Boyd, the song was unsuccessful on its initial release. That matters. Nobody bought it in 1970. The world wasn't ready for it or didn't know what it was yet. It took years and the band breaking up, and Clapton almost destroying himself, before the song became the classic it is. Art doesn't always get its due immediately. Sometimes it has to wait for the world to catch up. But the whole album, not just Layla, is a document of a man in a specific kind of pain. Clapton had fallen deeply in love with Pattie Boyd, and he fought his feelings with heroin and by writing songs about his infatuation. The best of them, Layla, would become the sprawling centerpiece of Derek and the Dominoes' only studio album. Every track on that album is a window into the same room. The room where Eric Clapton was sitting in 1970, burning up with something he couldn't have and couldn't put down. Bell Bottom Blues, I Looked Away, Anyday, I Am Yours. The titles alone read like a confession. And they were. All the songs he wrote and co-wrote for the Derek and the Dominoes album, including Bell Bottom Blues, I Looked Away, I Am Yours, and Anyday, were part of that same long love letter to Pattie Boyd. One album's, one feelings, one woman's. And the guitar playing, oh, the guitar playing. It's hard to get any better than Clapton and Duane Allman on guitar, with songs about unrequited love. That record might be the greatest document of unrequited love in rock history. Then 7 years later, after the pursuit had ended and the marriage had begun, came Wonderful Tonight. And listen to what that song is doing. Where Layla screams, Wonderful Tonight whispers. Clapton wrote the song for Boyd, a man watching his wife get dressed, asking her if she looks alright, telling her she looks wonderful. It's the simplest possible love song. It's a man who spent a decade screaming at the top of his lungs saying quietly, I have her. She's right here and it's wonderful. But even Wonderful Tonight carries a weight if you know the context. Because the marriage that produced that song was already being eaten from the inside by alcoholism. The man who wrote that delicate, tender ballad was also the man who was drinking himself into someone unrecognizable. The man watching his wife get dressed and thinking she looks wonderful was also the man who would, years later, admit to things that no amount of beautiful music can cancel out. Eric Clapton later admitted to abusing Pattie, stating that he was physically abusive toward her during their marriage and was a full-blown alcoholic. That's his own admission, not a tabloid accusation, not someone else's account. His own words in his own book about his own behavior. And to his credit, he didn't hide from it. He put it in print. He acknowledged it. But acknowledgement doesn't undo the thing acknowledged. The music after the divorce is a completely different sound. Listen to Old Love, released as Clapton rebuilt his life in sobriety. The song documents the end of his relationship with Boyd. It's slow and heavy and searching, a man trying to understand what happened to something that had meant so much. Boyd told a newspaper that she was hurt, that he should write a song about such a sensitive subject. Saying the end of a relationship is a sad enough thing, but to then have Eric writing about it as well. It makes me more sad, I think, because I can't answer back. She couldn't answer back. The music was always his medium. She had inspired it, but she couldn't control it. That asymmetry is worth dwelling on. Boyd inspired the Beatles' Something, and Clapton's Layla and Wonderful Tonight. 3 songs that will be played forever at weddings, at memorials, on radio stations that haven't been invented yet. And she had no authorship over any of them. She was the subject, not the artist. She was the inspiration, not the creator. And when the music turned dark, when Old Love came out, when the songs started to document the disintegration instead of the longing, she couldn't write back. She could only listen. What she did instead was write a book. In 2007, she published a memoir, Wonderful Tonight, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Me. And she named it after his song. Even in her rebuttal, she used his title. There's something about that choice that feels like the whole relationship in miniature. She was always operating in his language, even when she was trying to speak in her own voice. Clapton gave her permission to publish his love letters when she was writing the memoir. He let her have that. He let her tell her versions, which says something about what was left between them, not love, not resentment, but something quieter. A kind of mutual acknowledgement that this thing they had been to each other was too big to pretend away. The headline for the newspaper excerpt that ran when the memoir came out read, "ERICCLAPTON's drinking killed MY marriage." And Clapton, who was at his local grocery store when he saw it, said the headline editor chose to castigate him quite strongly. That's almost funny, the British understatement of a man who is standing in a shop wondering if the neighbors are watching him. Read a newspaper that announces his failures in capital letters. But it was fair. The drinking did kill the marriage. He knew it, she knew it. Now everyone in the checkout line knew it too. As a solo artist, Clapton has sold more than 100 million records and become one of the best-selling musicians of all time. Some estimates put his total album sales at over 280 million across the globe. He is the only artist inducted 3 times into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The numbers are staggering, but the numbers don't capture what makes Eric Clapton matter. What makes him matter is what he was willing to put into the music. The full unguarded weight of himself, the obsession, the grief, the shame, the love. All of it translating directly through 6 strings into something that hit people somewhere they couldn't protect. The music was always the most honest version of him. The interviews were careful, the autobiography was brave, the memoir headlines were humiliating. But the music, Layla in 1970, Wonderful Tonight in 1977, Tears in Heaven in 1992, Old Love in 1989. The music told the whole truth always. And the truth the music told from beginning to end kept circling back to the same place. The same woman. The woman he could never quite account for. The woman the songs couldn't fully capture even when they were specifically about her. Pattie Boyd said something that stuck when she jokingly told a newspaper that she had asked for a share of the royalties from Layla in the divorce settlement. And Clapton had said, "Are you kidding? That's why I have to write books." She said it as a joke, but there's a real point underneath it. The song exists because of her, the obsession was about her. And she walked away with nothing but a name's Layla, and the knowledge that something eternal had been written in her honor. For some people that would be enough. Pattie Boyd, to her credit, decided it wasn't. When Christie's held the auction of the Pattie Boyd collection in March 2024, the items sold for almost £3 million, far exceeding the original estimates. The original cover artwork for the Layla album, the one Clapton had personally chosen, sold for 33 times the pre-sale estimate at nearly £2 million, setting a new auction record for original album artwork, 33 times the estimate, a bidding war. The love letter written on a page from Of Mice and Men, that desperate, impertinent, handwritten cry from 1970, sold for over €139,000. Someone paid €139,000 for a letter torn from a Steinbeck novel and covered in the handwriting of a young man who couldn't stop himself from reaching for something just out of reach. That letter is now someone else's treasure. Someone framed it, someone will look at it. And Eric Clapton's hand, the hand that played all those notes, that wrote all those words, is preserved in ink on a stolen page forever. Boyd said at the auction, "I've had them all for so many years, far too long. I thought, why don't I just sell everything and let everybody else enjoy it?" And she also said, after the sale, "I am completely blown away by the enthusiasm of international bidders. For these special treasures, I am so happy that new hearts will now enjoy them as they enter into their next chapters." That's someone who has found peace with the past. Someone who can look at the letters from the man who pursued her, married her, hurt her, and loved her and feel not bitterness, but gratitude that other people find them meaningful. There's a particular kind of reckoning that happens when a person turns 80. The math of a life becomes very clear at that age. You start to see which things lasted and which ones didn't, which choices mattered, which losses you actually recovered from, and which ones you just learned to carry. Eric Clapton turned 80 on March 30, 2025. And if you've been paying attention to everything described in this story, the obsession, the music, the marriage, the ruin, the recovery, then his 80th birthday lands differently than just another number. He made it, that's the first thing. Against odds that would have stopped most people cold. Heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, the death of a child, a marriage he burned down, a music career that required him to constantly excavate his own pain and amplify it for stadium crowds. He made it to 80s. He's been married to Melia McEnery since 2002. And by all accounts, that marriage is what stability actually looks like. Not the burning, consuming, impossible kind of love that wrote Layla, the other kind. The kind that lasts. He still has fans frantically speculating about what he'll do next. Teasing announcements, hinting at reissues, keeping people guessing. The music hasn't stopped. The instrument hasn't been put down. He's 80 years old and still playing, still releasing. Still the man with the guitar who made the walls of London say Clapton is God when he was barely out of his teens. The longevity is remarkable, but it's not the most remarkable thing about him. The most remarkable thing is what Clapton has always been willing to say out loud. In his autobiography, a brutally honest and unsparing look at his life, near death and recovery, he named everything: the heroin, the alcoholism, the abuse, the infidelity. the homicidal fantasies in the direction of Mick Jagger when he took one of Clapton's girlfriends. He confesses without embarrassment that he can't remember all of what happened, that his memory of the late 60s right through the early 80s is severely hampered. He says he needed nudging to remember what he did. That's the honest accounting of addiction, not the romantic version, where the artist suffers beautifully and creates masterpieces. The real version, where whole years disappear and you have to ask other people what you did. Where you wrote letters you don't remember, made music in a haze, and woke up decades later trying to piece together the person you were from the fragments other people saved. Eric Clapton has been honest about all of it. And in a world full of people who polish their own legacies, that honesty is actually worth something. And what about Patty specifically? What has he said looking back from this side of 80? About the woman who started all of this? About the woman he pursued for a decade, married, and then failed? He has said that the songs were real, that the feeling behind Layla was as genuine as anything he ever created. He gave her permission to publish his letters. He allowed her to tell her story. He didn't fight the memoir or its headline. He stood in the shop, read ERICCLAPTON's drinking killed my marriage on the front page, and thought, are the neighbors watching? Not this is wrong, just everyone can see me now. Patty Boyd, meanwhile, has been generous in her own way. Not about everything. She hasn't softened the record of what the marriage was. She hasn't rewritten the abuse or the infidelity or the IVF grief into something manageable. But she's also said things that suggest a kind of earned perspective. She joked about the royalties. She sold the letters but said she wanted new hearts to enjoy them. She has described herself as lucky that her life continues to bring her joy. She's in her 80s, married to a man who isn't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times, living a life that doesn't generate headlines every week, and she seems genuinely content. Now in her 80s, Boyd is still going strong, and her photography exhibitions have earned acclaim for her keen eye. The camera she's been holding for decades has given back to her what the marriages never fully could: authorship. She is the one who decides what the image is, how it's framed, what gets included, and what falls outside the edges. After years of being the subject of George's songs, of Eric's songs, of every journalist's questions, she became the one doing the looking. That is not a small transformation. And the material legacy of her connection to both men is extraordinary. She was the creative inspiration behind hits including The Beatles' Something, and Layla and Wonderful Tonight, songs that have been covered, sampled, and played at more human moments of joy and grief than anyone could count. Christie's head of sale Adrian Humesayer said Boyd's life and career chart some of the key moments of the cultural revolution that changed the world in the 1960s, and that the auction offered collectors an unparalleled chance to see and own a piece of cultural history. That's not exaggeration, that's just what her life was. So what does it mean that at 80, Eric Clapton admits the woman he could never forget is Patty Boyd? It means the music was telling the truth all along. Layla didn't come from calculation. It didn't come from a marketing meeting or a creative session, where the band decided they needed a big emotional centerpiece. It came from the same place everything real comes from something that wouldn't let go. From a feeling so big and so unsolvable that the only option was to turn it into sound, and put it in the world and hope that someone else felt it too. The fact that it destroyed things in the process, that the pursuit hurt people, that the marriage caused damage that cannot be undone, that a woman who inspired transcendent music also absorbed real, personal pain. Because of the man who wrote it, none of that cancels the other. Both things are true, the songs are real, the hurt was real, the love was real, and the failure was real. Eric Clapton at 80 is a man who knows all of this because he lived it, and because he was honest enough to say so. His journey from teenage blues obsessive to global superstar spans over 6 decades. That's not just a career, that's a life. And the thread running through all of it, from the first time he saw Patty Boyd at George Harrison's side, through the writing of Layla, through the marriage and the drinking and the ruin and the recovery, is the same thread that runs through every great piece of music. The desire to reach someone, to say, here is what it felt like to be me, here is what I felt. Does anyone else feel this? And the answer for 55 years and counting has been yes. 1 billion times yes. There's one more image worth sitting with. It's 2001, George Harrison is dying. He came to visit Patty Boyd, brought small gifts, and they played music and had tea. They sat in the garden. He noticed some flowers blooming through the dirt, shaking in the breeze, and said, "The flowers are shivering." She sensed that he wanted to see her rather than leave it too late. He died later that year, and Patty Boyd was the last person from that part of his life he came to see. Not because of the past, but because in the way that only someone you've loved and lost, and stayed connected to can be, she was still someone who mattered. That visit, those shivering flowers, that last cup of tea. That's what love actually looks like when all the music and the fame and the obsession and the chaos has finally settled. It looks like two people sitting in a garden, not needing to explain anything, just being there before there's no more time to be there. That's what both of her famous marriages were pointing toward. Not the songs, not the headlines, not the auction, just the irreducible fact of connection. The thing that doesn't go away no matter what you do to it. And that's the thing Eric Clapton still carries at 80. Not the obsession that burned itself out a long time ago. Not the guilt, though that's probably still there in some form. What he carries is the knowledge that there was one person who changed everything, who turned his guitar from an instrument into a confession, who gave his whole restless, hungry, impossible emotional life somewhere to go. He could never forget her because forgetting her would mean forgetting the most alive he ever felt. And at 80, with everything he's survived and everything he's lost, he's earned the right to say that plainly. Some people never forget the person who showed them what they were capable of feeling. Eric Clapton is one of them. Pattie Boyd was that person. And Layla, all 7 minutes and 11 seconds of it, is the proof. The Pattie Boyd collection, with its letters and photographs and album artwork, sold for nearly £3 million at Christie's. The numbers are remarkable, but what the numbers are really measuring is something older and more fundamental than money. They're measuring how much people want to be close to something real. They're measuring the value of evidence, of a physical, holdable proof, that the songs came from somewhere, that the feeling was genuine, that two people really did exist in that particular intensity for that particular time. Someone bought a love letter torn from a Steinbeck novel. Someone paid nearly £2 million for a painting of a blonde woman. That reminded a young guitarist of someone he couldn't have. Those people aren't buying nostalgia, they're buying confirmation. Confirmation that what they heard in the music was true. That it wasn't just a performance, not just a rock star doing what rock stars do. It was real, she was real. And the man who couldn't forget her spent 60 years making sure the rest of the world couldn't either. Eric Clapton has sold over 280 million albums. He's been inducted into the Hall of Fame 3 times. He's survived things that should have killed him several times over. But the thing that people come back to, the reason the conversation never ends, the reason the auction room went wild over a painting and a letter, is not the career. It's the story. And the story is simple, as all the best stories are. A man loved a woman he couldn't have. He turned that love into music. He eventually got the woman. And then he lost her through his own failures. And he has never, not once, pretended any of it was simple. That's not something most people manage. That's not something most legends manage. At 80, Eric Clapton still carries Pattie Boyd. Not as a wound, not as a regret, but as the truest thing he ever felt. And every time someone puts on Layla, they carry her too. Felt, and every time someone puts on Layla, they carry her too.